There are moments in war that history never fully captures. Not because cameras weren't rolling, not because no one survived to tell them, but because the human mind, in those precise and irreversible seconds, refuses to process what is already mathematically inevitable. This is one of those moments. And the men and women on that base had absolutely no idea it had already begun. 8 minutes earlier, 8 minutes that nobody on the ground was counting, because nobody on the ground even knew the clock had started. A coordinated salvo of Iranian ballistic missiles had torn free of their launch rails somewhere beyond the horizon. Not drones, not mortars. Not the slow, trackable arc of artillery that gives a trained soldier even a heartbeat of warning. These were ballistic missiles, purpose-built instruments of annihilation, engineered specifically to rob their targets of the one resource that matters most in warfare time. And now, 8 minutes into their terminal journey, they were no longer climbing. They were falling, screaming downward through the thinning atmosphere, at velocities exceeding 3 times the speed of sound, Mach 3, or roughly 1 mile every single second. Each warhead was locked into what military analysts call its terminal arc, that final, steep, near-vertical plunge where aerodynamics give way entirely to gravity and momentum, and where the physics of interception become brutally, almost surgically unforgiving. At that speed, the gap between radar detection and point of impact can be measured not in minutes but in the width of a single breath. The target below them was not an abstraction on a targeting map, it was a helicopter flight line, concrete pads, fuel lines, rotor blades folded and still. Aircraft worth hundreds of millions of dollars sitting in the open, crewed by maintenance personnel who were, at that precise moment, doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing on any other ordinary operational night. They were working. They were focused. They were completely, catastrophically unaware. This is the nature of the strategic ballistic threat that American and coalition forces have now confronted with terrifying regularity across the modern Middle Eastern theater. According to verified reporting by ABC News and confirmed by U.S. Central Command on June 23, 2025, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps launched a coordinated missile barrage directly at Al-Udeid Air Base in Qatar, the single largest American military installation in the entire Middle East, as part of what Tehran codenamed Operation Glad Tidings of Victory, short range, medium range, ballistic, simultaneous. And on that night, one of those missiles pierced the Patriot air defense umbrella, entirely striking a communications dome that housed a $15 million secure satellite relay system linking CENTCOM commanders across the entire region. The base had been warned, aircraft had been evacuating, and still one got through. That is the operational reality this script is built inside of. Not a hypothetical, not a war game scenario, a documented, confirmed, satellite-verified strike on American soil, or as close to American soil as the modern forward-deployed military posture allows. Now pull back to that helicopter flight line. Pull back to those 8 minutes that nobody was counting, because the problem, the incoming supersonic terminal arc problem, had not disappeared simply because no warning had been issued. It had only gotten smaller in the sky, closer to the ground. Closer to the people who did not yet know they were the target. The problem got smaller, but the solution, whatever solution remains, still required someone to move toward it, dangerously close, with no margin left for hesitation, no room for doctrine, and no guarantee of survival. There is a particular kind of silence that exists on a military base in the seconds before everything changes. It is not the silence of peace. It is not the silence of rest. It is the silence of 10,000 moving parts, human, mechanical, electronic, all functioning exactly as designed, completely unaware that the design is about to be stress-tested against a threat it was never fully built to absorb. And then the silence ends, not with a gradual escalation, not with a warning that gives the mind time to transition from normalcy to emergency. It ends with the kind of violent, total, instantaneous rupture that rewires the human nervous system at the molecular level, the kind that combat veterans describe years later, with the same hollow look in their eyes, the same pause before the sentence, the same quiet that follows the telling. Someone saw something, or something saw something, a radar return, a thermal signature, a data point screaming through a network of sensors that had been scanning the dark horizon for exactly this kind of event, hoping the way all early warning systems hope that the alert would never have to be sent. But it was sent. And somewhere on that base, in a room lit by the cold blue glow of tracking screens and threat assessment displays, a human being read the data, cross-referenced it in a fraction of a second against every piece of training they had ever received, and made the call. Incoming, ballistic, multiple. Time to impact measured now not in minutes, but in seconds that were already evaporating. This is the moment that breaks the geometry of conventional military response wide open, because the doctrine for ballistic missile defense is built on distance. It is built on depth, the concept that interception must occur early, high, and far from the intended target, in the boost phase or the mid-course phase, where the geometry of a kill shot is still mathematically achievable. The Patriot system, The THAAD battery, the layered air defense architecture that American forces have deployed across the Middle Eastern theater, all of it is engineered around the principle that distance buys time, and time is the only currency that matters when a warhead is falling from the stratosphere. But in the terminal arc, in those final near-vertical seconds of a ballistic trajectory, distance is gone. The geometry collapses. The engagement window shrinks to something so narrow that human reaction time alone becomes the limiting factor, and human reaction time, no matter how well trained the operator, no matter how rehearsed the crew, is measured in biological milliseconds that the missile's velocity renders nearly irrelevant. According to a technical assessment published by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute (SIPRI) following Iran's March 2026 ballistic strike toward Diego Garcia, analysts confirmed that terminal phase interception of high-velocity ballistic warheads remains one of the most technically demanding challenges in modern air defense architecture. One missile reportedly failed in flight, the other was engaged and destroyed. But the margin between intercept and impact was razor thin. And on a night when the warning came late, or did not come at all, that margin could close entirely before a single defensive system had the opportunity to fire. That is precisely the operational environment into which the people on that helicopter flight line had just been violently, suddenly, irrevocably thrust. And here is where the mathematics of survival becomes something beyond calculation, beyond doctrine, beyond the clean, rational frameworks that military planners build their threat assessments around. Because when the problem arrives at terminal velocity and the solution space has already collapsed to almost nothing, what remains is not a tactical decision. What remains is a human one. A decision made not in a briefing room, not in a simulator, not with the luxury of deliberation and committee review and risk versus reward analysis. A decision made in the open air, on a flight line, with the sound of something supersonic tearing through the atmosphere above and the full terrible weight of what that sound means pressing down on every single person standing in its path. The instinct, the biological, evolutionary, deeply human instinct, is to run, to get low, to put as much concrete, as much earth, as much distance between yourself and the incoming trajectory as the next 3 seconds will allow. Every nerve in the human body is engineered for exactly this response. Flight before fight, distance before engagement, survival before mission. But on a helicopter flight line, with aircraft fueled and armed and positioned in the open, survival and mission are not separate calculations. They never were. Because if those aircraft burn, if that flight line is taken off the board in a single terminal arc strike, then every subsequent operation that depends on rotary wing lift, on medevac capability, on close air support, on the logistical threads that keep a forward deployed force alive and mobile, every one of those operations becomes degraded, perhaps fatally. The loss of the flight line is not just a loss of machines. It is the severing of capability threads that run in every direction across the operational theater, connecting units that have no idea on this particular night how dependent their survival is on the aircraft sitting on that concrete below the falling warhead. So the people who understood this, the people whose training had burned this understanding into them past the point where fear could dislodge it, made a different calculation, not a comfortable one, not a clean one. Certainly not one that the rational mind, given any meaningful window of deliberation, would have arrived at through logic alone. They moved toward it, not away, not to cover, toward the problem, toward the flight line, toward the geometry of a solution that the missile's terminal arc had already made brutally, almost insultingly small. Because the problem had gotten smaller in the sky, but the aircraft were still on the ground, the fuel was still pressurized, the rotors were still folded, and the seconds were still running. According to verified accounts reported by Stars and Stripes following the June 2025 Iranian missile strike on Al-Udeid Air Base, in which a ballistic warhead penetrated Qatar's integrated air defense layer and impacted inside the perimeter, U.S. personnel on base had begun emergency dispersal. Procedures in the minutes before impact. Aircraft were moved, personnel were repositioned, and still, the missile found its mark, the communications dome. The $15 million nerve center connecting CENTCOM to its entire regional command architecture gone in a single warhead's terminal detonation. The lesson embedded in that strike was not subtle. Distance alone does not guarantee survival. Dispersion alone does not guarantee survival. The only thing that comes close, the only human variable that shifts the odds in the terminal phase, when the geometry has already collapsed and the clock has already expired, is what a person chooses to do in the seconds that remain. And on this flight line, with the arc of incoming warheads bending toward the Earth directly above them, someone had already made that choice. Getting dangerously close was no longer a tactical option under consideration.